So in this module, we're going to cover config files and presets. These are a way to save a colossal amount of time in the middle of a production. After painstakingly setting up your movie render queue settings with the file types, output locations, console variables, color outputs, we don't need to do this manually every single time for every single shot. That is where presets come in handy. We'll also cover how to set up batch rendering for all of your shots. So with our sequence open here, let's open up the movie render queue. So we're going to click on this, or alternatively, Window, Cinematics, Movie Render Queue. By clicking on Unsaved Config here, you'll see that we have all of our render settings painstakingly set up. We've added a whole bunch of console variables. We've set up our color output. We've got our custom anti-aliasing settings. In the Output tab, we have our output directory, our file name format. Everything is set up and ready to go. So we're going to hit Accept, but now let's say we want to add a second shot, a second sequence to our movie render queue here. So I'm going to go to Render and add sequence 002, which is my second shot. Now, if I click on Unsaved Config here, you'll see, nothing is saved. I have to re-enter all those console variables, all the anti-aliasing settings. Everything needs to be redone from scratch. Oh, but wait, no, you don't have to do that. So we're going to hit Cancel. We're going to click on our first sequence that is already set up for us. And with everything set up correctly, we're going to go up here where it says Load, Save Preset. By clicking on this, we can save this as preset. So what that's going to do is save all of these settings as a preset so that you can apply this preset to all of your other shots. So I'm going to click on it, save it preset, and it's going to create what we call a config file. So I'm going to go to my Sequences tab here, and we're going to create an actual config file known as a master config. So I'm going to save this and name it configuration 01. And now you'll see if we click on the Load Save Preset button, configuration 01 shows up right here. So we're going to close this and go to our second sequence here, Load Save Preset, and apply that config. And now all of our render settings have been correctly applied to our second sequence. Hit the Accept button, and you'll see right here it says Settings Configuration 01. So if I wanted to add another sequence, I can go add sequence 3, and configuration 01 has already been applied. This is incredibly useful in production. It's going to save you so much time when you have multiple shots to render. Now there's another type of configuration file that we can create, and that's called the shot config. So you'll notice we have our 3 shots loaded here. I can actually save this queue. Let's say, for example, Unreal crashed, or I had to close Unreal and restart it. These might not show up again in the movie render queue. I would have to go ahead and manually add them every single time. So again, sequence 1, sequence 2, sequence 3. In this case, it's not such a big deal because we only have 3 shots. But in a production where you have 20, 30, 40, 100 shots to work with, it can be a pretty tedious process. So once you've loaded all of these once, we can go up here, click on Load Save Queue, and create an asset. So this is going to create a shot config file, which means we can load all of these shots with a single click. So I'm going to click on Save as Asset and call this Shot Queue 001. And now, if I were to delete all these, go to Load Save Queue, and we'll see here we have Shot Queue 001. Click on this, and all our shots with the correct configuration file had been added automatically. Again, this is a massive time saver in production. Now that brings me to my next point, and that is batch rendering, also known as queues. Now the movie render queue now has the benefit of being able to batch render, meaning it's going to start by rendering sequence 1, then it's going to render sequence 2, and then once that's done, it's going to render sequence 3, which means it's going to render all of your shots automatically for you. Whereas previously, with the sequencer renderer, you needed to render each shot individually, manually, one by one after the other. It was an extraordinarily time-consuming process. It was very tedious, and overall, no fun. It was a terrible way to work, especially when you had a high number of shots to work with. But now, with the movie render queue, hence the queue part of the name, that solves this issue. But there is one thing that you need to keep in mind, and that's set up by default. You don't need to do anything else other than add your sequences to the list here. So if your sequence is here in the Job tab, that means the movie render queue will render it automatically for you. And on top of which, movie render queue can render sequences across multiple maps or multiple levels. So for example, shot 1 here was rendered in the abandoned apartment map, which is this one here. But sequence 2, my second shot, was actually in another map, in an entirely other level. You need to designate that right here. So I know for a fact that sequence 2 was actually not in abandoned apartment, but it was found in modern apartment. You need to designate it as such right here. Otherwise, you will only render black frames. It's not going to work. So just be aware that if you're adding multiple sequences across multiple levels or multiple maps, you must designate them correctly in the section here. So once that's set up correctly, all you need to do is hit render local and let the movie render queue do all the heavy lifting for you. So to conclude, config files are a wonderful way to save a lot of time in the middle of an urgent production, so use them as much as you can.